And I'm going to go ahead. Hi, I'm Nick Fry. I'm the Barriger curator here at the University of Missouri St. Louis. I'm going to go ahead and mute everyone. We're about to get ready to start our session, and we'll do an introduction, just a review of what we're going to be going over today, and then we'll hand it off to our first presenter, Dr. Roger Grant. So we'll get that set up here. Okay. Okay, we don't have anybody in the waiting room. We'll go ahead and start now. First, I'd like to thank everybody who's joining us today. My name is Nick Fry again. I am the curator of the John W. Barriger III National Railroad Library here at the University of Missouri St. Louis. This is the second of our Barriger seminars that we are doing during this pandemic to make up for the loss of in-person events. Fortunately, it looks like things are getting better, so we will be transitioning to more in-person events as the fall goes on, and this format may wind up evolving over time. Our first seminar was on the Monon Railroad because Mr. Barriger was a president of that company. Today's seminar is going to be on the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific because the Rock Island was essentially Mr. Barriger's place to hang out between jobs. He was there on and off from the 1950s into the 1970s. And he always had a role of traveling freight agent. He had that on all his business cards, even when he got up to a vice presidential appointment with the company. And today we have three distinguished presenters that are going to be talking with us. The first will be Dr. H. Roger Grant, the Catherine and Calhoun Lemon Professor of History at Clemson University and author of many, many books on railroad history. On creating the Rock Island system. We're going to be followed up by Steve Hill, a retired engineering standards manager and lifelong model railroader, researcher, author, and volunteer, and a former president of the Rock Island Technical Society on Bureau, Illinois, a busy Rock Island junction. And we're going to wrap up the day with Dr. Greg Schneider, the R. Rowe Cross Distinguished Professor of History at Emporia State University in Kansas on why did the Rock Island collapse. And also, you may be familiar that Roger and Greg have both written books on this railroad and or its successors, such as the Iowa Interstate. And I believe everything's still in print. So if you do want to pick some of those up, they are available. And Steve has done some really great work with freight cars on the prototype modeling side. And Steve, you did I know I've got you muted. You can unmute if you want. The last book that came out was the UTLX cars, right?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, great work on that if you're working on tank cars for your model railroad. And that's what we're doing here. We're bringing professional historians, enthusiasts, modeling modelers into kind of a hybrid historical conference and RPM meet. And because every one of those conferences has all been hindered by the COVID situation. So we're trying to use a unifying theme of a railroad that Mr. Barriger was involved with and go from there. We are going to have this available on YouTube once this is done. Hopefully I'll have it up tonight. And we'll go ahead and start now with Roger. One thing I'm going to ask everyone, I'm going to mute all the participants or ask you to mute if you aren't already muted, except for Roger. And we're going to use the chat function to get questions. So I will pop up the chat window if you've got it minimized when Roger's getting to a point where he's going to be able to take questions. And I will read them to him, so it's on the recording, and then we'll have the answers. And then we'll have a little bit of a break between each presentation. We should be done in about 3 to 3.5 hours, depending on how long breaks and questions go. So without further ado, we will hand off here to Roger. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nick, and I'm delighted to provide some of my insights, if they are indeed insights, into the system. In other words, why does the Rock Island map look like the Rock Island map? But before I do that, let me say a few things about my interest and background. As I point out in the preface to A Mighty Fine Road, which appeared last year from Indiana University Press, I indicate that I'm a native Iowan. I grew up in Elbia, which was a great railroad community for a young rail fan, being on the main line of the CB&Q and the secondary lines of the Wabash and Minneapolis and St. Louis. And in fact, earlier the town had two interurbans. One, the Elbia Light and Railway that went to the mining camps of Heitman and Hawking, and also what became an electrified steam road, eventually the Iowa Southern Utilities, and in its last years, the Southern Iowa Railway. And needless to say, I didn't see the first interurban because it was abandoned in the mid-1920s, but I do have faint recollections of the Elbia segment of the ISU operation. It was abandoned between Moravia and Elbia in 1948. And of course, there were many rail fan rides sponsored by the Iowa chapter of the NRHS on the Southern Iowa. Let me say that even though I didn't grow up in Rock Island country, I did see Rock Island operations in Centerville, south of Elbia, and also in Sheraton. And speaking of 1948, I still have relatively good memories of seeing the famous whistle stop tour of Harry Truman. He stopped in Sheraton in 1948 in September. But then as a undergraduate at Simpson College, which is south of Des Moines, I certainly was well aware of the branch line operations into Indianola. And the branch line locomotives, BL2s, certainly fascinated me, especially when they were switching the local industries, particularly Laverty elevators. And I actually rode on the Rock Island from Des Moines to Chicago on several occasions. But as a professional historian, my early books did not deal with railroads, but I came out of the closet, so to speak. And my first major railroad book was A History of the Chicago Great Western. And I've always been fascinated with corporate histories. And in fact, I did histories of the Great Western, the Chicago Northwestern, the Erie Lackawanna, the Wabash, the Georgian Florida, a road that you may not be that familiar with, but my wife said, find something that's not too far from Clemson, and also the LC&C, which is a railroad from the 1830s and 1840s, Louisville, Cincinnati, and Charleston. Only 10% of the LC&C was built. But the point is that I did work on 3 Granger railroads that were essentially competitors or interchange partners with the Rock Island, the Great Western, the Northwestern, and the Wabash. And then I nibbled. I think I did more than nibbled around the edges of the Rock Island. I did a biography of Jervis Langdon, who was president of the company in the latter part of the 1960s. And then I did a biography of John W. Barriger III, which was really made possible by his late son, Jack Barriger. And also, I did a book on Henry Posner's Railroad Development Corporation, and I do include a chapter that covers the Iowa Railroad and the Iowa Interstate Railroad. So it seemed natural to think in terms of doing a Rock Island history. And I must say that all of the corporate histories that I've attempted to write about and discuss in a logical and rational fashion, this has been the most difficult. The period of the Reed-Moore Syndicate is baffling, and you really need an MBA degree or maybe a PhD in economics to figure all of it out, at least from my perspective. Well, when we look at the map of the Rock Island, and this map that we see on the screen is obviously one that was not the most recent in the sense that perhaps the high point of mileage came in the mid-1930s, but I'd like to think, let's say 1946. And people are wondering, why in the world do you have a railroad that runs from Watertown, South Dakota to Eunice, Louisiana, and then you have one from the Twin Cities that goes to Dallas-Fort Worth, and eventually to Galveston, needless to say, trackage rights in that case. And then you had the St. Louis to Colorado Springs with the line, again, trackage rights into Denver. And there's certainly lots in between. When you look at the map of the Hawkeye State, you see that the Rock Island in some ways resembles a plate of wet spaghetti. And it had the greatest mileage of any of the Granger roads in Iowa. So I think before I start to build the Rock Island, and I'm not going to include all of the branches, etc., just look at the main course and really to focus on the two great periods of expansion, one under R.R. Cable and then the wild expansion under the Reed-Moore Syndicate, led by good old Judge Moore, who wasn't actually a judge, but he was a lawyer. But let's just look at the Rock Island in comparison to other Granger roads. If you look at the Northwestern, and I'm going to use mileage from immediately after World War II, the Northwestern had slightly over 8,000 route miles, whereas the Rock Island had about 6,700 route miles. The Northwestern was sprawling like the Rock Island, and some wags pointed out that it ran from somewhere, the Windy City, to nowhere, Lander, Wyoming. But it really did have plans to expand to the Pacific Northwest. It had that Pan-Pacific dream fantasy, and in some cases it became a reality. But the Northwestern also had a plethora of branch lines in Iowa and Wisconsin, in South Dakota, and certainly in eastern Nebraska as well. And, it ran from Duluth to Des Moines and had some kind of interesting appendages in Iowa. One, a coal mining one that went to Buxton and Consul in Monroe County, was actually predicted to go to Kansas City. Now, eventually, the Northwestern, as you probably know, got to Kansas City, but simply by absorbing the Chicago Great Western in 1968. Now, if you look at the Northwestern, it is a sprawling Granger road. And speaking of the Northwestern and the Great Western was obviously much smaller, about 1,500 miles, and it is compact. Chicago, Twin Cities, Kansas City, Omaha, via Owine, Iowa, the core operating center of the Great Weedy. Now, the Milwaukee resembles certainly the Rock Island and the Northwestern, and in places the Great Western. It certainly had a large number of main, secondary, and branch lines, but it did get to the Pacific. The Pacific Coast Extension, which stretched from South Dakota to Washington State, opened in 1909, which was not a great financial investment for the Rockefellers and others. But the point is, it did go from somewhere to somewhere, and it was a road that expected to really do well financially. It was going to be the great competitor of James J. Hill's Great Northern and then the Northern Pacific as well. Now, if you look at the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, unlike the Milwaukee, which got up to almost 11,000 miles, the Q had about 8,300 miles, certainly comparable to both the Northwestern and the Rock Island. And this Granger Road, which was really a road that in some ways didn't go anywhere. Well, it did. Chicago to Denver and then to Billings, and certainly had a large amount of secondary and branch line lines. And if you look at southern Iowa, northern Missouri, the Burlington certainly controlled the area. In fact, my present book is dealing with 5 twilight area railroads in western Iowa, and the Burlington was one of the reasons why these lines were built, because it did have a real monopoly, explaining such railroads as the Iowa and Southwestern and the Creston Winterset Des Moines, companies that you have probably never heard of. But let's go ahead and look at the system as it evolves. Certainly, the Rock Island has a great reputation for being an early bird. It was the first railroad to reach the Mississippi River. The Chicago and Rock Island Railroad got there in 1854. And the 2 great spark plugs of the earliest Rock Island construction were Henry Farnham and Joseph Sheffield. And it was a wonderful team. They were honest. They did remarkable work. It's just a wonderful story. And the Rock Island, too, is the first to bridge the Father of Waters, the Mississippi, in 1856. But then the Mississippi and Missouri Railroad, which is more or less an affiliate, certainly Farnham is involved, Sheffield drops out. But what I'm trying to say here is that if you were going back into the 1850s, 1860s, you would assume that the M&M would be the first railroad to reach the Missouri River, Council Bluffs. And in fact, it did not. It would be technically the third, but the second Chicago railroad to reach the Bluffs. And the Northwestern, through subsidiary companies, got there in 1867. The Rock Island got there one day after the ceremonial spike ceremony at Promontory, Utah Territory. That was on May 10th, 1869. Rock Island gets to Council Bluffs a day late, but it was an interesting celebration. And the Rock Island will build a southwestern extension that later becomes the route of the Golden State trains as such. And it will have a number of small branch lines in Iowa. In other words, these are feeder lines, and they are relatively successful. The one that I always liked, it was 18 miles long, but it had a grand name. It was the Carson, Avoca, Macedonia, and Southwestern Railway Company. And it ran from Avoca to Carson. And you might think, you know, why did they not build it under their own name? But this was a time when these branch lines were not known necessarily to be profitable. And if the Avoca to Carson branch line was a big money loser, it would go bankrupt, and it would not affect the parent company. And what the Rock Island did would be to lease them, and eventually it would be fused into the system. In fact, that's what it did in 1878 when it leased the Keokuk and Des Moines K&D, or KD as it was often called. And that railroad was the first to get to Des Moines, and it was a grand celebration when it got there in 1866. The Rock Island was a little later in reaching the new Iowa capital, having been removed from Iowa City. And then in the 1930s, it's actually officially absorbed into the Rock Island. But the KD was, in some ways, a rather important railroad running from Keokuk to the state's capital, and then it would be expanded under other corporate names to the northwest, up to Gallery, for example. Well, let's look then at the big expansion story. And it really comes in the 1880s under RR Cable. Isn't that a great initial for a guy in the railroad business? RR, Ransom Cable. And he was what I would call the builder of the Great Rock Island route. And Cable was willing to gamble. He was willing to have the Rock Island jump over across the Missouri River, in part because of the failure of the Iowa Pool, which was a rate-making group. And this occurs in the mid to late 1880s that we see the expansion. And what I should say about Cable is that not only did he have a wonderful mansion, which is still in existence in the near north side of Chicago, but his philosophy was that of a through freight type railroad. He was not too excited about online industries and warehouses and that type of thing. He was thinking of essentially a fast freight line, and one that would establish itself as a result of trackage rights and lease arrangements. And in many ways, he's not one of the great railroad leaders. He's not a James J. Hill. He's not a Charles Perkins. He's not an Alexander Cassatt. But he certainly did leave his mark on the Rock Island. And the expansion is in Kansas, Indian, Oklahoma territories, and Texas. Now, Oklahoma as a state is not coming into the Union until 1907. It's sort of a complicated story. When you look at the map, you can see that Horton, Topeka area becoming important to the company. And we find that there are going to be various routes that will be constructed. Certainly, one of the important ones would be down through Harrington, a town that had already received the Missouri Pacific, but the Rock Island worked closely with Harrington and people in that area. And Harrington would be the jump off point too, not only to go to Liberal, Kansas, and later that would be extended to Tucumcari and Santa Rosa, New Mexico territory, but also that would be the point where the railroad heads south through Indian Territory into Texas. But before I mention that, I should point out that at McFarland, Kansas, this is where we are going to go west through Phillipsburg, Kansas, and essentially to Colorado Springs, technically Roswell, Colorado. That's where they had their repair facilities, and then trackage rights into Denver from Lyman. And again, trackage rights, an important part of the tale. And then you see in Oklahoma, I'll not keep referring to it as Indian Territory or Oklahoma Territory, but the point is that they did push south to Wichita and then to Pond Creek, Oklahoma, Indian Territory. And then we follow later the 98th Meridian, which is the old Chisholm Trail, famous in American ranching frontier history, to Fort Worth. So we can say that cable did do a lot to shape the Rock Island map. That's obvious. Also, too, he was involved in the Burlington Cedar Rapids and Northern and its predecessor, and also in the Minneapolis and St. Louis. The Minneapolis St. Louis doesn't become a part of the Rock Island system map, but the BCRNN does. And originally there is a joint relationship between the Burlington and the Rock Island. And in 1902, we find the BCRNN going into the Rock Island system. But you look at that map and you think, why in the world are they going to Watertown, South Dakota? Now, it's a lovely place, actually, but Cable had his eyes on extending that line to Bismarck or some connection with the Northern Pacific. So this was one of those Pan-Pacific dreams, and that's where that line was headed. So we can say that Cable is part of that first great expansion thrust. And by the time he left the Rock Island, or at least when he stepped down, he stayed on a little longer on the board, but he created a system that was about 3,500 miles long, which is certainly an impressive railroad system for the time. Now, it's not surprising we find this expansion in the 1880s, because if you look at when the greatest decade for railroad construction in American history occurs, it's in the 1880s. America had recovered from the nasty bank panic of 1873 that triggered depression until 1877, 1878. Yes, Wall Street has its ups and downs. There was a mini depression in 1884, 1885, but boy, this was really the go-go years for railroad construction. Now, it's not to say that there aren't other periods when we have a great deal of railroad building. Actually, following the 5 troubled years from 1893 to 1897, America's worst depression, there will be construction into the pre-World War I period. Well, let me say a few words about the Reed-Moore Syndicate. And wow is the operative word when we talk about system building. Well, the railroad industry really hasn't had many robber barons. Now, students seem to think that all railroad leaders were robber barons. In fact, when I was the chief reader for AP US History and on the test development committee, I made a robber baron question. And out of 200,000 students that responded to this free choice question, not one student in the United States or abroad ever questioned the assumption about robber barons. They all thought robber barons existed. Well, there were a few bad apples, and the Reed-Moore Syndicate represents bad apples. The Reed-Moore Syndicate, it had various names, but we'll just call it the Syndicate, had 4 participants, William and James Moore, and William Moore, known as Judge Moore, was really the ringleader. And then you had Daniel Reed and William Leeds. And these individuals got involved in a number of activities in the trustification electrification of America, everything from the tin plate industry to the National Biscuit Company, although Reed and Leeds were not a part of some of these earlier activities. Anyway, in 1901, we find these four men are able to seize control of the Rock Island, throwing out Warren Purdy, who had been relatively conservative. In fact, that had been a complaint about the Rock Island. It had not built enough branch lines or secondary main lines. It was really the kind of corporation where you would want to invest the holdings of widows and orphans. It was certainly a fine Wall Street investment vehicle. But this all changes with the Reed Moore. And my goodness, they get involved in massive expansion. Well, for one thing, they do complete the Golden State line, and Purdy had started this, and it would be finished in the summer of 1902. And it goes from Liberal, as I said before, to Tucumcari and Santa Rosa, New Mexico territory. And this was the most difficult piece of railroad the Rock Island ever built. If you ever go to the panhandle of Oklahoma, Texas, this is a relatively barren area. I think you can see the end of the earth from this part of the United States. There was a problem of water shortages for the construction crews, and also there was a deadly, and I verbally underscored deadly, outbreak of smallpox. And supposedly there were mass graves that were constructed along the line. So yes, this is a piece of trackage that's extremely important, and I'm very pleased that the Reed Moore Syndicate did complete it to a connection with Charles Eddy's El Paso and Northwestern, which allows the Rock Island to have access to the El Paso gateway connection, obviously with the Southern Pacific. Well, not only do we find the completion of the Golden State route, but we will see the actual fusion of the Burlington, Cedar Rapids, and Northern into the Rock Island system. And there was a maze of branch lines, some of which were really unprofitable, like the line from the Iowa City area to Clinton, Iowa. I think people are sort of surprised that Clinton, Iowa once had the Rock Island, since it's well known for being a division point on the Northwestern. And then we have the Choctaw route, the Choctaw, Oklahoma and Gulf Railway, which was 636 miles long, running from Memphis west into Oklahoma Territory, which would then be expanded to Amarillo, and later it would go further west. But certainly this was a major acquisition, and one that was probably a good idea, because you were going to be able to serve two state capitals, Little Rock and Oklahoma City, although Oklahoma City at the time was not the capital, because it was still two territories. But the point is that unlike the Fort Smith and Western, they gambled on Guthrie, and Guthrie was not going to be the capital, and it never became a great metropolitan community, city, whatever. Although the Rock Island did serve the city of Guthrie sort of indirectly. But the point of the matter is, look, now we have the BCRNN and we have the Choctaw route. And then there's going to be more. In 1904, we find nearly 300 miles of railroad either purchased or constructed between Kansas City and St. Louis. And now we have access to the St. Louis Gateway, which is not insignificant. And now we have the Frisco connection. And just as I think we can argue that certainly Judge Moore and his younger brother James are robber barons, joined by Reed and Leeds, that Benjamin Franklin Yocum is a robber baron type. Now, I'm not that knowledgeable about all of his actions, but this guy was cagey. He was a smart cookie and actually will outfox the Moore brothers, Reed and Leeds, later. Well, here we have the Frisco, the St. Louis-San Francisco Railroad that obviously never gets to San Francisco, but it does serve Arkansas, Kansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, Indian Territory, and Texas. And it certainly has access to a lot of freight traffic, agricultural, timber, minerals. It was an interesting property. And what we are seeing now is that we have essentially a kind of union between the Frisco and the Rock Island. And this explains now this extension down to Eunice, Louisiana. So in other words, you look at the map and you think, Watertown, South Dakota to Eunice, Louisiana, and it ain't as the crow flies. It's no straight route. Well, certainly with the Choctaw route, you would see acquisitions of short lines, and Arkansas seems to be the epicenter for short lines. You could look at Clifton Hull's history of short lines in the Diamond State, or the State of Opportunity. I can't remember exactly its official nickname, but the point of the matter is this explains the extension into Louisiana, and the object was to reach the New Orleans Gateway. And so we find the acquisition of multiple short lines in Arkansas. And in 1905, there is the creation of the Rock Island, Arkansas, and Louisiana Railway. And this is really the corporate pathway to New Orleans. But with the connection with the Frisco, instead of building a parallel line from the Eunice area into New Orleans, we simply have an interchange with the Frisco. And then there's Texas, and this is a complicated story too. It involves really the Trinity and Brazos Valley Railroad, and we find, first of all, the Rock Island building between Fort Worth and Dallas in 1903, which was really a smart move. And now we have an objective of the Gulf trade. And of course, New Orleans is a part of that story as well. And as a result of sort of cobbling things together, and again using trackage rights, we find service between Dallas and Houston being established in 1907. And a year later, trackage rights over a Santa Fe affiliate to Galveston. And this whole Texas complex, or at least much of it, will eventually morph into the Burlington Rock Island Railroad in 1930. So that's rather important. Certainly from passenger service, we can now go from Houston to the Twin Cities in time. So the point is that we just have this enormous expansion. And it's not just the Rock Island and the Frisco. We find that Yocum and company will get control of other railroads. In 1904, the Chicago and Alton, they pull the wool over E.H. Harriman's eyes. This doesn't last that long. They then get involved in the Toledo, St. Louis, and Western, better known as the Cloverleaf, and also the Chicago and Eastern Illinois. That's a complex story, but it's kind of a tinker toy type arrangement, because Yocum will turn on the Moore brothers, and this is really the first major spike in their coffin. And eventually, well, 1909, 1910, Yocum withdraws from this whole Frisco, Rock Island system. Complicated. It's one of those things where you really have to look at your notes. And I might add, this is a sort of two book projects behind what I'm thinking about today. But anyway, you do have, I guess the bottom line, folks, is that you've got a system that's supposedly operating 14,000 route miles of line, going to 17 states plus New Mexico territory. So, you know, this thing really unravels 1908, sort of in the wake of the bankers' panic of 1907. So it's 1908, 1909 to be exact. But there's going to be more building. We find 1910, even though we don't have this major system anymore, that the line 113 miles long between Amarillo and Tucumcari is built. Also, this is when the St. Paul and Kansas City short line comes into being. The Rock Island by 1911 already controlled the St. Paul and Des Moines Railroad, and there would be a 65-mile gap between the Golden State Line and Carlisle, Iowa, and that's where the line went west to Indianola. Not very far, of course, but what I'm saying is that the St. Paul and Kansas City short line is created, and this is the railroad that bridges that gap. And it's completed in 1913. It's the last major railroad building project in Iowa. Even creates a few new town sites. 1913, 1912, 1913. Relatively late, obviously. And so now you've got that direct route from the Twin Cities to Kansas City. And this was really a good move. Also, let me say that we will see some other construction after the Reed Moore Syndicate collapses. This sends the Rock Island into its first bankruptcy, which is 1915. And in the 1920s, and this map does not show it, we find a rather interesting construction in Oklahoma, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. This is the 153-mile line between the Golden State route at Liberal and the Choctaw route at Amarillo. And in World War I, there was a huge expansion of agriculture in this area. It's called the Great Plow Up. And this hardy Turkish red wheat was much in demand, high protein content, blah, blah, blah. And the Rock Island gets sucked into this. These are not the Reed Moore people. They're all dead by this time, incidentally. And so we find the construction north from Amarillo in 1926, and the line is completed in 1929. And there's also going to be a crosscut route north of the new town of Stinnett at Moore Junction to Delhart, Texas on the Golden State Line. That's 62 miles long. And there were some other plans too. But then we have the coming of the Great Depression, and then the Dirty 30s, the Dust Bowl, and no more new line construction in that area. uh, they had a real problem. This was actually an alternative route in case there was a blockage on the Golden State Line, but the Canadian River Bridge that was originally designed was never built, and so you have some rather steep grades on the south approach and also the north approach to the Canadian River. One was over 3%. So this was a real choke point on that piece of construction. Then after the 1930s, well, actually in the 1930s, we do find some additional construction. These are really involving line relocations. One is 82 miles long. It's called the Kansas City Trenton Short Line project between Trenton and Birmingham, Missouri. And also there's going to be cooperation with the Milwaukee, essentially the double tracking the line between Birmingham and Pullo, Missouri. That's 37 miles. And that activity occurs between 1929 and 1931. And then at the end of the 1930s, during the John W. Barringer or John W. Farrington, John Dow Farrington, I'll get it right. My wife's maiden name is Farrington, so I should be able to keep the name straight. Is that famous Cimarron Bridge project, which is northeast of Liberal, Kansas. It's a 8-mile new line with this massive high-level bridge, and it certainly solves another choke point. And the Cimarron River could be really troublesome. It was a pesky stream. And then we have the largest rail relocation project in Rock Island history, and this is the Atlantic Iowa Cutoff, which begins in 1951 and goes to 1953. It involved 34 miles of new line construction, plus 11 miles that will be leased on the western part of this undertaking from the Great Western. And this will shorten the main line by about 10 plus miles. So that was important. And that's something Henry Posner is very happy they did. The Iowa Interstate benefits from the Atlantic Cutoff. And then, yeah, I could even throw in another piece of construction, not very long, 11 miles. And it's between Winterset and Earlham, Iowa. The station, it's not the station, it's just a signpost. It's called Winair, Winear, may not pronounce that right, but look, kind of clever. WIN for Winterset, EAR for Earlham. And although 11 miles long, this was a good investment because the Rock Island no longer would have to haul rock, and there was a big quarry. In fact, this had been the goal. The Rock Island had a monopoly on this movement. The Creston, Winterset, and Des Moines certainly wanted to get to it, but obviously never got any further than 21 miles northeast of Creston at Macksburg, Iowa. I'm working on that presently, so throw that out. But anyway, what I'm trying to spit out is that this was really a good idea because they had to take the rock east to Carlisle, and they also connected with the at Somerset with Indianola branch. Kind of complicated track, but they had to pay a rather hefty tax to the Des Moines Union Railway to haul it to a customer essentially in West Des Moines. So this really not only ended that, and that resulted in the abandonment of 25 miles of branch line, which was good, and also they could still serve Winterset, and they could move that rock more effectively to its primary customers there in West Des Moines. So anyway, I've not covered everything, but it is complicated. But if you look at the system map of a Northwestern, Milwaukee, or a Burlington, it's complicated. And hey, I would say that the 501-mile system of the Georgia and Florida between Greenwood, South Carolina, Valdosta, Madison, Florida, it's also complicated, trust me. although these are little pieces that were cobbled together in 1906, 1907. So anyway, that's it. And welcome to the great Rock Island system, from Watertown, South Dakota, to Eunice, New Mexico, or Eunice, Louisiana, Chicago, to Tucumcari, and in between, and Denver too, and St. Louis. There you have it. It did go to some great gateways, but there was a lot of lease trackage, a lot of trackage rights, and there weren't that many communities that the Rock Island of any significance controlled. Des Moines, maybe, Rock Island, Moline, Davenport, maybe not Davenport. But anyway, let's just say the Rock Island probably should not have gotten involved in so much trackage and lease rights. So there. Thank you.
Thanks, Roger. We appreciate it. We have the chat open now, and I'm going to go ahead and say open up for questions. We do ask for some folks joined us in the middle of the lecture and missed the introduction. We are using the chat function to take questions from the audience. So if you do have questions, please type them in the chat. I'll read them out to Roger, and that way we can guarantee that everybody's inquiry is going to get recorded for posterity. I do have a question with the Rock Island coming into St. Louis. We acquired a map at the Barriger that was a proposed railroad, and it seemed to be kind of a Santa Fe backed proposal.
That's right.
And it almost follows the routing that the Missouri Division was built on. How often did they find themselves, ruining these days where they were? I guess it's hard to find company documentation, but were there ever situations in the 30s and 20s where people saying, "Boy, I wish they hadn't done that," because now it's so hard to abandon that property at that time frame, because they've got the ICC. When they're building all these little pieces until 1907, there's really no problem with like that. We're done. Walk away from it.
Yeah, the St. Louis line was not well engineered. There's no question about that. And the Santa Fe did control that eastern part that was built west towards Union. I can't remember all the details. In fact, there was another railroad that was involved directly west of St. Louis. But it did get them to St. Louis, and it had what? At least one tunnel? I can't remember.
Yeah, it does have a tunnel.
Yeah, and it sort of reminds me of the Great Western that had the famous Winston Tunnel. You think, here's a railroad that is serving the Midwest, and you got a tunnel. And the Winston Tunnel was really quite long and a real pain. Yeah, well, the Missouri Pacific got the best route, and then the Wabash had a decent route, and the Burlington too. So but at the time when this is being put together in 1904, it's still the railway age, and you are absolutely right. You don't really have to worry about the ICC because it doesn't get significantly strengthened until the Hepburn Act, 1906, and the Mann-Elkins Act 4 years later. So it's not really going to be a speedway. It's hill and dale, and the western part is better engineered. But there were townside opportunities that occurred, and what can I say? Yeah, it was a lot easier to build and to abandon railroads before federal regulation and the progressive era regulation that beefed up state commissions. Although you do have the Granger commissions, Granger laws of the 1870s, but that didn't have really much to do with the construction or the lack thereof, whatever.
It does lead to one of the great what ifs. If the Rock Island UP merger had gone through, then
Uncle Pete would have really rebuilt that line, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, what would have happened with the Mopac? Because I live in Kirkwood, which is on the old Mopac main, and until the coal market imploded, we were seeing a lot of tonnage come through our little town. And if that had gone, if that merger had not happened, that could all be going through Chesterfield, the nice expensive suburb of Chesterfield.
Well, the opening in 1904 was good for local passenger traffic to the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis. So, it had some immediate activity with special trains, etc. And it did serve communities that really were either inland towns or had bad railroad service.
Yes. We got a question from Greg. Richard White in Railroaded says that the western expansion probably should have occurred the way the Rock Island was built, piecemeal rather than with a lot of land grants and corruption. What do you think of this argument?
Well, I don't know. Yeah, land grants made it possible for several transcontinental railroads. But look at Hill. He didn't get any land grants. Well, he did with the Manitoba Road. But the point is that, you can't say the Rock Island didn't have corruption. Certainly, the Reed Moore Syndicate milked the company, a very complicated corporate structure. I don't know. That's one point of view. I don't think it's totally wacko. But what the Rock Island should have been able to do, hopefully, they could have maybe purchased the SP and got to California. Richard Saunders, who's written several books on railroad mergers, and a retired colleague of mine, thought that if the Rock Island had gotten to Los Angeles or to the Pacific in some fashion, it would have lasted longer. But I don't know. That's counterfactual history, and that's nothing that I can really handle. But
Roger, I was just thinking of that in your book and your presentation, because I mean, here's a perfect example of how White might be wrong. If you put together a railroad piecemeal, you expand by buying and purchasing other bankrupt railroads like the Chicago, Kansas, and Nebraska. You don't get to the Pacific. You don't get to a transcontinental line. The Santa Fe obviously does between Chicago and LA, and the only one that does. I mean, so in some respects, it's a showcase of how his argument might be really problematic in a way.
Yeah, well, even the Santa Fe did get some federal land through the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad, whatever. Yeah, I think piecemeal is the way to build. You can overextend. Look at the Milwaukee Road. Look what happened when they didn't get any land grant real estate. They just built, and they eventually sent the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul into real dire straits in the 1920s. And most of it was abandoned. Well, at least a big chunk of it. The last train through was 1981. Not a happy story. Damn Panama Canal came in, and that kind of upset the apple cart too.
If we really want to do a depressing story, we do the Milwaukee seminar. Bradley Scott had a question. He wanted to confirm: are you considering doing a book on B.F. Yocum and his system?
No, I'm too old to do that. It's too much work. And I'm got this fun project of dealing with these little railroads in southwestern Iowa. I did a book for University of Minnesota Press called Twilight Rails, but I've always been fast. I did one of the 5 railroads that I'm studying, but it's the Sunset Cluster that I'm working on. No, we really do need a good study of Yocum and the Frisco. We desperately need some other company histories. The Northern Pacific and the New York Central have really been ignored. I mean, not totally, obviously, but if I were 25, 30 years younger, I think I would tackle the Northern Pacific. It really, speaking of a land grant story, that's going to be a really complicated part of the Northern Pacific tale. But no, there's a lot of railroad history. And as a board member, director of the Lexington Group, you know, we have scholarships, and we are encouraging graduate students to work on railroad history topics, but it's just not cool today. And but railroad history covers every aspect. It covers gender, it covers race relations, it covers immigration, it covers the waterfront. But it's really sad that there's a lot that needs to be done. And just look at what's happened since Staggers. All of these, you know, we need a Genesee and Wyoming history, you know, not just the short line in New York State that holds salt. There's just so much to do, and, you know, so little time to do it. Well, maybe not, but I don't know. There's just a lot of wonderful topics that need to be explored. So there.
No argument there. Dave asks, can you recommend any sources for the development of the BCR and N and acquisitions?
Oh, well, yeah. Don Hoffsummer did a book not too long ago that is a history of the Burlington City Rapids and Northern. And Don is an excellent railroad historian, and I would highly recommend it. It's been done, and it was a labor of love. He's really Iowa oriented, being a native of Spencer and a undergraduate of then Iowa State Teachers College, Northern Iowa University now. But no, BCR&N's been studied. Yippee.
Excellent. Let's see. That looks like that's all the questions we have. So we are going to take a couple minutes and we'll switch over from the screen you're seeing now to Greg's screen, so he can do his to Steve's screen, so he can do his presentation. And if you do have questions later on, Roger is available through email through his Clemson address, or if you email me here at the library, I can get messages to him if you have trouble getting a hold of Roger's email. So let me go ahead and switch. I'm going to stop my screen share here.